you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank for the opportunity to speak at this event. For those less familiar with Platts, we do price assessments, news, and market analysis in a broad range of commodities, from oil to petchems, metals, natural gas, and also agricultural commodities. In agricultural commodities, we are present in biofuels, sugar, and more recently, grains. We also believe there's a need for more knowledge around these areas, and we've launched a daily grains report earlier this year, focusing on the Black Sea grains as well. So I'm very keen to talk you through and discuss all this with you later on. But today, I'm here to talk about ethanol. I must admit, I was very faithful to the script I was given by Jack. So I will start by giving a global picture of the ethanol, especially the fuel ethanol markets in the world, and then I will focus into Europe, and finally, last but not the least, the UK. So I'll start with the world today, and I like to start with good news. And the good news is that the total fuel ethanol consumption in the world has been going up. When you look at this chart, you see that the bulk of this consumption is located in the Americas, and with North and South America accounting for nearly 80 billion liters of an estimated total demand of 90.5 billion liters. So they are really, a lot of the fuel ethanol world is concentrated in the Americas. Looking a little bit more into detail, we see that the top players are the US and Brazil. Together with the EU, they represent 91.5% of the total fuel ethanol production and roughly 90% of the world fuel ethanol consumption. When we take the US and Brazil alone, and they are really the top players, they have different characteristics and in a way are different markets. The US demand is really mainly dependent on the mandate, so there's direct blends with gasoline. It's a quite complex mandate in the sense that on the ethanol side, the traditional corn ethanol mandate is now reached a ceiling, and all the increase in the mandates will be advanced biofuels from now on. And the big majority of this fuel ethanol is produced from corn. In Brazil, we have a slightly different case. Ethanol is mainly produced from sugarcane, and roughly 40-45% of this demand is also mandated. So there's a 25% blend in gasoline. But the majority of this Brazilian demand, it's highly price sensitive because in a way it's competing with gasoline. There's a really growing fleet of flex fuel vehicles, which means that the driver can choose at the pump whether they use ethanol or gasoline depending on price. So we have very different models here. I will talk about the European case a bit later on, but just to give a bit the linkage with the trade world, the US and Brazil, they represent 60% of the world exports. So when we focus on trade and on the trade flows, we see that, again, not surprisingly, the big players are the US and Brazil. But very interestingly, over the past 5 years, their importance has been shifting. It's kind of being a competition between the top exporters. We had years where Brazil, and in particular Center-South Brazil, was the top exporters, but the US in other years have also exported a lot. By the end of the day, we are talking about agricultural commodities, so a lot depends on the weather. And for example, in 2011, when you see that there was a considerable decrease in Brazilian exports. It was one of the reasons was the weather, so it's not that surprising. But it's always more interesting to give a bit of a picture and a bit of color to all this. And I'm not going through all the years until 2014, but I picked 3 years that I thought were interesting to show you. One of them is 2009. So we had Brazil was literally supplying the world in terms of fuel ethanol. They were shipping more than 1 billion liters to Asia. They were exporting to the US as well, more than 1 billion liters, and to Europe, according to our numbers, 941 million liters. The US was also exporting, but it was very little comparing to Brazil. But in just 2 years' time, so if we jump to 2011, we have a completely different picture in terms of trade flows. Brazil lost their position, again partly due to the weather. They had a very bad cane crop in that year. And at the same time, the US really took over. And in 1 year, when you compare 2010 with 2011, the US has increased more than 3 times their total exports. Canada became an important market. They were exporting more than 1 billion liters to Canada. But they've also exported to Brazil, which was kind of surprising at the time, in part because despite the lower crop in Brazil, Brazil was still exporting to the US because their cane ethanol was considered advanced, so at a premium. So it compensated to have this triangular trade. And also the US was exporting quite a lot to Europe, so it really took the place of Brazil supplying the European market. So now if we jump to 2014, what do we see? We see that the US is still pretty much the top exporter, but interestingly, you will see from the size of the arrows, the total volume of ethanol that is traded around the world has indeed decreased. So we saw an increase in total consumption, but a lot of this increase were on domestic markets and on the key markets of Brazil and the US. The total trade has indeed decreased. We still see quite a lot of Brazilian ethanol going to the US, which some may find a bit surprising, but this is half of these volumes is indeed ethanol that is used to produce ETBE, which later is exported to Japan. So it's kind of a special case. So Canada remains a very important market. And the US ethanol has been so competitive that it's even reaching Asian markets, which are located further away. So as we had 2 years ago, a presentation guru giving us a training in our office, and he told us that it's very difficult to keep the audience attentive more than 15 minutes, and they will not take anyway more than 3 messages out of the speech, which is a bit frustrating for an analyst because we always think everything is interesting and everyone is taking a lot of notes. So I decided to give some takeaways after each part of my presentation. So the takeaway from this part 1 is that world ethanol consumption is increasing by 4.7 billion liters in 2014. That the US and Brazil account for a big share of this increase, so 1.8 billion liters increase in the US demand and 1.75 billion liters for Brazil. And at the there's lower global trade flows, so less volumes is being traded around the world, and all this increase has been mainly on the domestic markets. So now, focusing on the EU, because we are in Europe and there was a subject of interest for you. When we take the US and Brazil, so these big players out of the picture, we have kind of a second tier or second league. And there we see that Europe is the top consumer and producer of fuel ethanol, followed by Canada, China, Thailand, and Argentina. So we have a much more wider spread of and a wider picture here, which is interesting. We have different situations, and we have Europe is still a bit on a deficit. When we compare with 5 years ago, this deficit is much slower, but I will talk a bit more into detail later on. Canada as well is a big deficit. As you've seen, it's receiving a lot of ethanol from the US. But then the other markets are pretty much balanced, China, Thailand, and Argentina. They are pretty much balanced. In terms of European demand, we have a different picture from the world. So we saw that the demand for ethanol in the world was going up, but it's not the case in Europe. And in our estimates, we have pretty much stable from 2013 and considerably lower than the volumes we saw in 2012. And there's two reasons for this. One, you can see here on the chart on the right is that the total consumption of gasoline has been going down. In a lot of European countries, there's a fiscal policy that has been incentivizing diesel consumption. And at the same time, we also have the total fuel consumption that has been going down with the more efficient cars. But up until 2012, this was more than offset by higher mandates being applied in Europe. But right now, we don't see this evolution in terms of mandates, so we cannot offset anymore this lower gasoline consumption. So total fuel ethanol demand has been kind of stagnating. At the same time, production has been going up in Europe. When we compare 2009 with 2014 in our stats, we see that a big part of this increase has been made in the UK, in Hungary, and the Netherlands. These three countries were those contributing more to the increase in total production. So as I said, the deficit in these markets has been going down. Here you see and the big question is, are we moving towards self-sufficiency? Well, we have the capacity in Europe to be self-sufficient, so it will, by the end of the day, be a matter of prices and a matter of margins for producers. Of course, I decided, so this chart is one of the charts that I had it yesterday morning. So for those who are still following me, you will not find them in your presentation, in the pack of slides. I decided to add this. They are a rough estimate of margins because mainly we are comparing the feedstock price with ethanol prices. And we know that with these big crops that we've seen in previous presentations, the grains prices have been going down in Europe, but ethanol prices also decreased with big production. So for certain periods, and the beginning of this year was particularly challenging for producers of ethanol from wheat, for example. You see that the margins were negative. Right now, things are looking better. So we still foresee continuation of an increase in total ethanol demand here. Finally, looking at the feedstock side, so all this has been a more global view of total production. And when we look per feedstock, we still see that the grains take the big share. More than 60% of the ethanol produced in Europe is produced from grains, and roughly 30% from sugar feedstocks. So, again, as promised, takeaway from part 2. We don't see any pressure coming from EU demand, from the demand side. We see a continuation of a lower gasoline consumption, and the mandates are not increasing fast enough to offset that. EU ethanol production is growing, and it's mainly dependent on grains, and the demand gap has been shrinking, and I haven't talked a lot about this, or I haven't even mentioned, but it has happened also after the anti-dumping case with US ethanol. So now the UK industry. The UK, when we look at, so we took US, we took Brazil, and we have Europe as the third largest player, but within Europe, we have many countries, and we see that the UK comes on the top 3 in terms of production and consumption of fuel ethanol after France and Germany. Again, we have very different situations in Europe, and we have markets in surplus and they are exporting like France, but we have also markets in bigger deficits like Germany and the UK, which still import quite a lot of ethanol, particularly from Europe these days. The case of the UK, it's interesting because it has a mandate as many other European countries, but it's a biofuels mandate, so it's not specific to ethanol or biodiesel, so we saw some dynamics here. Originally, this mandate was being fulfilled mainly by biodiesel, but lately, and in terms of volumes, we see that ethanol really took a part of this share. One reason why biodiesel consumption has been going down is because of the double counting. So even though they are counting for the mandates, in actual volumetric terms, you have less biodiesel being used. But we see that ethanol consumption has been going up, and now it's kind of stabilized. In terms of feedstock, we see a very similar picture to the one presented for Europe globally, where we have grains have the big share in terms of the feedstock used, and sugar feedstocks have a lower one, but it has been growing. I have to say that this data is not the actual ethanol that is produced in the UK. This is the ethanol that is consumed in the UK, so it includes imports as well. We see this share more or less stabilizing. We don't see a lot of we don't expect a huge shift in this share of feedstocks used for ethanol. Whoops, and there was a typo there, feedstock. Sorry. Final comments. So I gave my kind of takeaways throughout the presentation. So for the last slide, I thought it was more interesting to just identify the things that could change this picture. So the first one is what is going to happen in Germany. We know, and we've seen in the past, that many times the changes that happen in Germany end up being, contaminating in a way other countries in Europe, and they become the standard. So Germany decided to change their mandates from a volumetric term. So you don't, right now you need to replace a certain volume or an energy of your gasoline or diesel by the biofuels, and they decided to change that and say that instead of that we have a certain thresholds of savings in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we think that overall this could be beneficial for ethanol when you compare with biodiesel, because the levels in terms of GHG savings for ethanol are higher savings than for biodiesel. But we are in many countries close to a blend wall. Usually we talk about blend wall about the US, but we are actually pretty close of reaching the 5% blend wall in Europe. So even though using more ethanol could be beneficial in terms of GHG savings, and in this new policy framework, if we don't move up this wall, there could be some constraints. But it's something that certainly we need to look after and see on the detail which changes are going to be implemented in this country. The second potential game changer is again policy related, which is not surprising because we are talking about biofuels. And it's the 7% food crop biofuels cap that was voted earlier this year by the Parliament. Again, when we compare biodiesel and ethanol, we think that there's some advantages for ethanol. We don't believe it will change the status quo because we are not using more than 7% on average anyway right now, but it could it could impact the future evolution in the market. The third potential game changer are all the free trade agreements that are being negotiated by the EU and in particular with North American countries. This could have a big impact on these markets. The first, the one that is more advanced is the one with Canada, and there was already a draft of this agreement circulating where ethanol was indeed included. And even if we don't consider, as some say, that this draft and this agreement with Canada could be taken as an example and a role model for the case with the US, even independently from that, a free trade agreement with Canada could already have a huge impact on the European ethanol industry because they have a huge capacity over there, and they could, for example, simply replace and consume domestically US ethanol and export their own production to Europe. So I think we are still far away from this, but it's something that could have an implication on the markets. And finally, because I like to finish with positive news, positive things, some good thing could be higher demand from India, for example, and Middle East, either by mandate, like in India, has been discussed in India, or discretionary blending, as we are seeing in some countries in the Middle East. And European ethanol can actually be competitive in these regions. You know, it's much closer to these markets and it has a freight advantage. And we've seen this year already, some European ethanol reaching these markets. So something, okay, maybe not game changer, but a positive message there. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We always like positive messages to end with. Questions, please, for Patricia. Have I got any hands that I can see around the room? Just tell me, perhaps I should know this, but you said about the EU having a 7% cap. That was related to some of the issues around food inflation. Could that be a change? Could that be revisited at some point? Do you see any chance of that changing as a level?
So the whole idea is to cap the use of food-related feedstocks to produce biofuels. And right now, this wouldn't change the situation today because we are not using more than 7% anyway, but going into the future that could be the case. It was already voted by the Parliament, and of course it needs to go through all the countries as well, but I most probably we think that it will be implemented.
Good question in the back, please.
Thank you. Hello, Heloise Taney from DEFRA. I just, on your last point about potential markets in India and the Middle East, I just wondered if there was any ethanol production in India or any potential for that to develop.
Well, they passed already a mandate which corresponds to a demand of roughly 1 billion liters Of course, all these policies tended to support local producers. So, and in particular, the sugar producers. But they have already opened a tender last year for international ethanol. So we could see that. Right now, there's really nothing going on there, but potentially is a big market.
I think people can hear the sign of the lunch being ready to be served upstairs. Thank you very much indeed for your
Thank you.
presentation. Thank you.